And now, right to your hosts of Down the Garden Path, Joanne Shaw and Matthew Dressing.
Hello and welcome to Down the Garden Path, where we discuss down-to-earth tips and advice while doing our best to help you seasonally manage your garden and landscape. I'm Joanne Shaw, owner of Down to Earth Landscape Design, and with me is my co-host and co-author, Matthew Dressing. Hello, Matt.
Good evening, Joanne, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Matthew Dressing, owner of Natural Affinity Garden Design. As landscape designers and gardeners, we believe it's important and possible to have great gardens, which are sustainable and low maintenance, and we want to help you make it happen.
That's right. And we're kind of celebrating tonight. We have a guest that we'll get to in a moment, but Matt and I wanted to share that we've broken 10,000 listeners. So we were really excited about that we're sharing that with you tonight on tonight's show. And we're excited that those 10,000 listeners get to hear from our guest tonight. So for over a decade, the gardening world has seen the continuous rise in popularity of growing your own food and food security. One of the most popular plants of this growing movement are apple trees. And if you live in the northern part of the country where winters can be long and unforgiving, hardiness is just as important as flavor. So joining us tonight to talk about his new book, Hardy Apples, Growing Apples in Cold Climates, is author Bob Osborne to talk about how to select, grow, and care for our apple trees in our cold climates. So do you have a question for Bob? We know you do because you were preparing them ahead of time for us about your apple tree or something you want to know about. Then please send them here to us at downthegardenpathpodcast@hotmail.com.
That's right. So just before Bob joins us on the show, a little bit about Bob. Bob Osborne is owner of Corn Hill Nursery in New Brunswick, Canada. He's a gardening author, a columnist on CBC Radio, and a member of several horticultural organizations. So welcome to the show, Bob.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you for joining us.
Yes.
We're so excited to be able to talk to you about apples and your wonderful new book. I'm sure we'll mention your other book all about roses as well.
Yes.
So why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about your background as a gardener?
Well, actually, I started out at 8 years old when my mother gave me a tiny plot to grow potatoes. And from that point on, really every year I was in a garden, except for 1 year when I was going to university. But basically, I've always had a garden. And we moved to New Brunswick in 1971, and it was a sort of gravel pit and a frost pocket. It was not a great growing area, but we had a good garden.
Yeah.
And then I went out to the local garden center and bought 5 apple trees, right? Oh, that'd be great. But they really did poorly. And part of it was our site, I'm sure, and my lack of knowledge. But a lot of it turned out to be the wrong cultivars for our climate. So I had Jonathan's and Red Delicious and so forth. And, while you can grow them here, they really don't thrive. They need a longer season to mature and so forth. And that got me interested in, what different apples should I get? And so I started to do research into apples, and that led me to rootstocks as well, which is really just as important as the tops when you're growing an apple tree. And so my father moved near us, and his land was amazing, like great soil. You could grow anything, dash a lime, and so we moved here and started the nursery. And my first crop was apples, and I actually have a record. It was about 42 grafted apples.
Wow.
So that was my first crop. And over the years, stubbornness and persistence led us down the path of gaining more and more different types of materials. And gradually we were growing thousands of apples each year. And we were interested in a lot of the older cultivars that are sort of disappearing right now. And there are many apple sleuths out there these days. It seems like every time there's a hole that needs to be filled, somebody comes along and looks for old apples and so forth. You know, I've been interested in collecting all of these over the years, and I had an orchard that was basically about 80 different cultivars, and it was kind of neglected. We just used it for wood, for grafting. We're not fruit growers. We are apple tree growers. And so it kind of went into decline because we started to use hedges for our scion wood. But gradually I thought, well, I never had the heart to cut it down. And so now as a kind of semi-retirement thing, I just have fun in the orchard, trying out various pruning methods. These are older trees, 42 years old. And they vary tremendously in what they get for scab and insects and so forth. So it gives me a palette of all these apples that we've grown for 40 years, and just put that together along with the histories and so forth, which I find amazing, because every apple has a history to it, if it can be found out. And so that's part of the book as well. But I want to tell people, you know, what kinds of soils are necessary for optimal growth. You can grow apples in many soils, but if you want a really quality apple tree, then you need to know all the particulars about your soil.
Would you say that's the biggest, aside from climate, would that be the most important factor in your success?
I mean, it's hard to say which is most important, but certainly soil and site has a great influence as well. But sometimes you don't have a choice of your site. It's your backyard or whatever, yes. Right? So really, soil, I think, and it has a great influence too on water, because a soil that holds too much water, like a heavy clay soil, will not be amenable to good apple growth. If you look where they grow wild, you'll see it's generally in higher pH soils that are almost gravelly, sandy loam. Not always, of course, but they like a free, open, draining soil.
Very nice. So you mentioned that you're in the business of not growing the apples themselves, but producing the trees themselves. Right. You mentioned the term scion and rootstock. So could you talk to that about, you know, grafting and producing the tree? What goes into creating an apple tree for our listeners?
Yep. Well, you have to start out with a rootstock. And we have two different types of rootstocks. Some are grown from seed. We have a special seed orchard where we collect they're old Russian apples, and we collect the seed and mash them and then sow the seed. And that gives us, there's a particular type of apples that we're using for that. So they tend to be fairly, you know, standardized in height and so forth, productivity. And then there are clonal rootstocks, and these are actually grown in what are called stool beds. And they start out with a type of rootstock they want, and they put them in hedges in the ground, and they cut them right back to the ground after a couple of years. And then they send out these big shoots, which they cover with sawdust and earth. And then the shoots root into that, and then they groom it away, and they cut those off. And so you have all these sticks with roots on them. And so, but the nice thing about those is that you know exactly how productive they are. You generally know how hardy they are. You know, there are all these things, like they've been studied for years, so there's data on them. So you can choose the right rootstock for what you are trying to do. What, you know, if you're a big grower or a small grower or whatever. And so you have these two types. And then what you do is you have what's called, you need scions. And scions, you think of it, you are a child of your parents, you are a scion, they're scion, right? And so what you're doing is you're passing on the genetics that, like, usually what we do is we have 1 year wood, last year's wood, which is usually vegetative buds, and that is snipped off in mid-March. It has to be totally dormant. You don't want any movement in the buds, and they're stored as close to freezing as you can. And then we take an individual bud and put it on the top of one of these roots, and we wrap it in a material called parafilm, which is kind of a stretchy, self-adhesive compound that they use for like covering beakers and test tubes and so forth. And that wraps it up, and we dip it in a combination of beeswax and tree rosin. And then that is our little tree. And then that is planted out in rows. And then we only allow that bud to grow. And so everything else is rubbed off. You don't want any of the rootstock taking the energy of the root. And so we end up with like a single shoot, usually about 3 to 4 feet tall. And then we leave that in the ground, and then you get a branch tree. And so we sell both the 1 year and the 2 year branch trees. But we have to have that scion wood so that we can continue to graft all these different types of apples. It's a little bit like having a museum, but it gets better instead of gathering dust.
So when you do the grafting of the scion to the rootstock, is there do you use chip budding or tea budding or a certain graft technique?
We generally use a whip and tongue. And so what you do is you make a slice at an angle on the rootstock and the scion wood that should match in size and shape. And then you make usually that, it's funny, you see in these grafting books, they have these great big long whip and tongues. We actually use quite short ones, and we find you get a much better match and no overhanging tails, as it were. And then we usually just put one bud, and it's a whip and tongue, but it's a section of the stem with one bud. And what that does is, especially for rare material or what we don't have many of, we only use one bud, so that you can, out of a scion stick, you might get 10, sometimes more trees out of one stick. So, and then once that is, once it grows, then basically you only let that, and you never let rootstock sucker up.
Nice, yeah. So harvesting all that scion wood goes quite a ways when you use just the one bud.
That's right. I mean, if I need 500 trees, then I can divide that by, whatever I think, depends on the scion, but sometimes you can get 8, 10 trees, 10 buds that are good.
Very nice. And so Corn Hill Nursery is mainly a wholesale supplier of just the apple trees.
No, actually, we used to be more wholesale and retail, but we've actually become more retail than wholesale now. And a lot of that had to do with COVID, believe it or not, because people were in their gardens, and all of a sudden our online orders exploded. And so we were shipping out lots of apples. So that seems to have continued. I mean, people have gone to basically ordering online for everything, and it's true in the nursery industry now.
Well, and that was actually going to be one of my questions of, are people just in your province ordering, or are you ordering like people from Ontario and all over Canada?
All over Canada, yeah. We have been doing US orders, although we're kind of thinking that we might stop just because there's so much hassle that it hardly seems worth it. But well, we shipped all over the world in some ways. The only thing is apples, though, is you can't cross the border. That's right. I'm thinking of roses, which we ship. But apples actually we can't ship outside. We can't ship.
Yeah, so they are just in Canada. That is great, because we've talked about that on the show when we've recommended that people consider, because often we'll get questions about when's a good time to plant a tree, and usually they're asking when it's really not a good time to plant the tree. So we're always kind of like recommending that they, call, look it up, redo their research, and you as being mail order, the best variety for them and the best time to ship it to them, right?
Right.
So we always kind of defer.
That's right. So you touched on soil. It does need a little bit of soil, some higher pH. Is there anything else regarding soil or preparing the planting hole we want to talk about before maybe we jump into some of your top recommended cultivars?
Well, I mean, I think it's very important to know your soil. So when you dig your holes, what kind of soil is it? You want to use the same soil back again when you're planting. Now, having said that, I would put up to 20%, let's say, a good compost, a little bit of blood meal, bone meal, alfalfa meal, something like that, a little bit for nitrogen, but not soluble, because you don't want soluble around the roots when you're transplanting. And then you basically put that in the hole and put that mix back around it. One thing you should do too is if you're doing an orchard, it's a good thing to have your soil pH tested, and that's just your acidity level. And they like to grow in a fairly neutral soil. So if you have an acid soil, put some lime, like just agricultural lime, in with it, just a handful, in with the soil, and then you should lime your entire orchard. And every 6 years, repeat that, and because that will put the pH up. If you're in the rare situation where you're in a high pH soil, like an alkaline soil, then you use sulfur generally to get it back toward neutral. But it's a lot easier to add lime to an acidic soil. So,
okay.
And then organic matter, I mean, is so important. It's like that organic matter is what's breaking apart what's being dissolved by bacteria and so forth. And as they eat that compost, so to speak, they're releasing the nutrients that are soluble and when the tree can uptake.
Okay.
So, it's like all of those are important things to think about.
Excellent. We do have one listener question, and since you were talking about planting the trees, Cindy has written in and she said, could you touch on a good way to mulch apple trees? So do we need to mulch apple trees?
It's actually a good thing with a caveat. Be careful of using too much mulch, because if you use too much, the rain sometimes will not get through. You have a dry period, and then you will not be able to re-wet the mulch and the soil. So I usually put it 2 to 3 inches, keep it away from the actual trunk.
Yeah.
We have problems with apple borers here now.
Oh.
We never had them, but we certainly have them now. And we paint the bottom foot of the tree with a latex paint, and seep it right into the soil a bit, because then they don't see it as a place to lay an egg. And so I'm not sure where were we? Tree planting,
Yeah.
I guess.
Oh, no, sorry. The mulch. So yeah, it was a mulch question.
That
definitely helps. Yeah. So that definitely helps.
The mulch basically, we use well-rotted bark, but you can use a wide variety of things, but it'll keep the soil moister generally, and you won't have the up and down freezing thawing effects that you do get in winter. So yes, I would use that. The only thing with certain types of mulch, like straw, straw's not too bad, but hay will attract field mice.
Yeah.
And so you want to put protection around your trunk too, because there's nothing worse than growing a tree for 3 years and then having it ringed by a vole or a mouse.
Yeah, a rodent. Yeah, definitely. So what is the time from when you start to when you can ship an apple tree? Like how long do you...
Well, the process is usually it takes us 2 years to grow a seedling rootstock. If we're using our own, we usually buy in clonal, because it's a clonal rootstocks is a whole different business. But we raise the seedlings for 2 years, and then they're grafted the next spring, and they're grown 1 year, and sometimes harvested as 1 year, but most of the time we would leave them for 2-year branch trees. And so altogether, it's basically a 4-year process. If we buy in the rootstocks, it's a 2-year process.
Okay. So usually when you're buying an apple tree in your garden center, it's maybe 4 to 5 years old on average, would you say? Maybe depending on the grower and their process.
If you're counting whoever's growing the rootstock,
true.
That's important too. So, but usually most of the trees you see are 2-year, sometimes 3-year. It depends on the market and a lot of things. And some people have all different sizes.
Very true. Very true.
Yeah, and we do want to describe the book is gorgeous. It is a full color, like textbook, you've really covered it all, right? Bob. So it's, I know that's one thing about doing radio or doing podcasts is people can't really see the book. And sometimes they're like, great little books. And like Matt and I wrote a great little book, but this is a really nice big book with excellent pictures and excellent examples. Like even, when you were talking about the scion and the smaller rootstock, I mean, you've got some really great. So it is, I think, a really important book for anybody who is really serious about growing apples. Bob, also even somebody who's just like a backyard gardener, or you more thinking more people that are really interested in starting like an orchard?
Well, hopefully it's for everybody. I mean, if you just want to plant one tree, it's still nice to know what are the best conditions for it. What should you be looking for? I mean, one of the things that we put in the appendix was a list of all of the cultivars that we cover, and when do they bloom, when is their season, what are they used for, and so forth. So there's zones and so forth. That way you can pretty well get a really good idea of what not to use, maybe, and look at some of the new options too that are out there. Some of the recent apple cultivars are really pretty exciting, like excellent flavor, excellent storage, crispness, juiciness, and also no scab, no mildew, no rust.
Excellent.
And so that's a huge weight off of any grower.
For sure.
That goes a long way to making it much more low maintenance and easy.
Well, I mean, the healthier that tree is, the less maintenance you will have.
Yeah.
In a way, yeah.
So where is our book your book available for our listeners to purchase?
I mean, as far as I know, you can go to any place, the usual Amazons and Indigo chapters and all of those places carry it. It's released throughout Canada, the US.
Excellent.
Perfect. So check out your chapters, your local Barnes and Noble, and definitely check out Amazon.ca and .com to pick up Bob's book, Hardy Apples Growing in Cold Climates. Don't forget to also check out cornhillnursery.com and take a closer look at that nursery operation as well. Do we have any listener questions before we continue with Bob?
We do. Brett has written in and he's saying, for those of us that want to, in brackets, try to grow apples here in Toronto, what would be the most successful one to try for our climate?
Well, actually, I mean, Toronto is actually in zone 6 at least, and you have the heat of the city. So you can grow longer season apples and so forth. One I really tout is called Liberty. Again, it's a very disease-resistant tree. Excellent. And what you want to do is, if you've got a small yard, that's when you want to choose a dwarf or semi-dwarf rootstock. So hopefully whoever is selling you the trees, make sure that they know what the rootstock is and whether it is dwarfing or semi-dwarfing and so forth.
Okay.
One of the things you have to remember is that a dwarfing rootstock, it doesn't strangle the tree or anything and make it small. What it does is it's very precocious. So it starts to produce fruit early. And so you have all the energy going into seed and rather than vegetative growth. The only disadvantage is that they tend to be somewhat shorter lived and they also have less than perfect anchorage. So they'll often just lean if you just don't stake them. So you definitely want to stake any tree the first year and then take it off. But if you're growing dwarfs, you need a permanent way to support that tree, at least for the first 10 years or so.
Ooh, okay.
And so that, it's very important that you realize that there's something that goes along with the dwarf tree.
Very cool. And what about semi-dwarf?
Yeah, semi-dwarfs are generally where I tend to put my my advice in, because they are generally freestanding, so they're generally well anchored, and you get a tree that's will grow up to about 15 feet maybe, and you also can be heavily influenced by pruning. You can keep a tree much smaller if you want.
Okay.
But those are some of the things that I think are most important.
Yeah. I think of when I first started designing, 15 years ago, everybody, we said at the top of the show about the trends. I was designing yards that had fruit trees, and the new homeowners were asking me to get rid of them and to design something else. And I've really seen the whole change. Like now they're wanting to know what apple trees and where they best spot for their apple tree. And other fruit trees as well. So I think it's been kind of cool. I mean, it's not like that's not a long time, right? Really, for that change to happen. So
that's right.
So Jane has written in another question for the GTA. She's saying, does she need to do anything in the fall or now for prepping her apple trees? She lives in the GTA, so the general Toronto area.
Nothing in particular, unless you haven't taken care of other things, like you could lime your soil. If you haven't lime your soil, that's definite. Or you can put like an organic fertilizer. Like one thing about fertilizing in the fall, a lot of people, oh no, you're not supposed to do that. Well, if you're using a soluble that creates really watery growth, yes, that's a problem. But if you're using something like alfalfa meal or phosphate rock or something like that, you're not really going to the tree will shut down when it wants to shut down.
Right.
And that has been proven. So you want to make sure that your tree is well fed. Other than that, you really won't have any trouble with hardiness probably. I don't know how much air pollution affects apple trees. That might in some neighborhoods that might be a bit of a problem, but I can't see it being in Toronto. I wouldn't.
Okay. Do you recommend dormant spray in the spring?
Good question. We don't use it. The only problem with the dormant is that you're killing things like overwintering mite eggs and so forth, but you're also killing predatory mites. And I find that it's a little bit of an overreach to do it. Now, I haven't really expanded myself too much because it's expensive to buy some of the new products. But we have a program now where at Petal Drop, we spray with BT, which is Bacillus thuringiensis. And what that does is it kills the larvae of butterflies and moths. That's it. So it's very specific. And you spray this on the trees, and as soon as the leaf rollers start to feed, they die. There's a stuff called spinosad in it, which is made by soil microbes. And it's like 0.025%. It's just a tiny amount, but it's very toxic to them. I sort of switched over here. But then what we do for apple maggot is usually here, they come up in early July. And what we have been using, it's a commercial product. GF 120, but I think it's sold as Naturalite, and basically it's kind of like a molasses base, but it has the spinosad, and you just you take your spinner out of your backpack sprayer, and you put this material with water, it's a concentrate, and you just flick it on every other tree or so, and what happens? The maggots come up. They're attracted, they feed it, and they die. They never mate, they never lay eggs. So I went from having every apple in the orchard infected with apple maggot to none, absolutely none. I was stunned. Wow. Now we still have things like, we tried codling moth. It's like a little trap it looks kind of like a little bow that you put on the top of the tree, and it releases a mimic of the pheromone that attracts the females, right? Or no, the females, so it attracts the males, right? And so it confuses them, but it didn't seem to work that well in my smaller orchard. I think it's for larger intense orchards, but those are the kind of things that we're fiddling with, right? That are, much more, they're organically certified, and it's just trying to see if we can grow some really clean fruit. But a lot of it has to do with cultivar. It's, like Novamac, it's just clean as a whistle, right? And so, you get some of these very disease resistant, it just makes so much easier to deal with.
Yeah. And with our smaller yards, I would think that the dwarf trees and the semi-dwarf trees would be a better choice as well.
Well, a standard tree can get big. Like some of our red astracans are 30 feet tall.
Mm.
You know, we gave up on those. They're just beautiful to look at. So, you know, and most of the fruit falls on us. We can't pick it, but it's still good.
Mm-hmm.
Nice. Speaking of apple cultivars, we are about to jump into some of the best ones for growing in cold climates. But I'm just going to jump in and say thank you, everyone, for joining us here live on Reality Radio 101. Thank you as well if you are listening via a downloaded podcast. I'm Matthew Dressing here with my co-host, Joanne Shaw, and you're listening to Down the Garden Path. Joanne and I enjoy hosting Down the Garden Path each week, bringing you interesting and relevant topics to help you achieve a great garden. We learn right along with you from our research and from the wonderful guests like Bob Osborne, who joins us here on the show. Don't forget, you can spend more time with us down the garden path. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Down the Garden Path Podcast is our handle there. You can also find us on your favorite podcast providers with lots of past content. And while you're there, please hit that subscribe button to be notified of new content. And please don't forget to like, share, and leave us a comment. We love hearing from you. You can always write us here at Down the Garden Path Podcast at hotmail.com or via our websites. You can find Joanne at www.down2earth.ca and myself at www.naturalaffinity.ca. So I think the big question on everybody's minds on all the emails are, what are the best ones that you think that we should grow? What are you recommending for cooler or cold climates that are your top performers?
If I had to plant a fruit orchard, I would plant Liberty, Nova Mac, Green Sleeves, Sandow, and
Sandow.
Yep.
Okay.
And oh my gosh, and for me, Frostbite.
Oh.
I mean, there are so many. I just feel like going down. You know, Spartan is a wonderful apple. There are a lot of great apples.
Yeah.
But those are the ones that I think will give you the least amount of trouble, will give you the most amount of fruit. They are all, I guess, user friendly, if I can say. Yeah.
That's funny to say
Because,
that. Yeah.
You know, I mean, you know, people still love their Macintoshes and Portlands and so forth, but they are much more difficult to grow, mostly because of apple scab, which is a fungal disease that afflicts especially Macintosh, but also Cortland. And so, you know, if you're trying to do that, then you have to deal with that fungus, and if you want clean fruit. And so that requires knowing the calendar, if you will, of when exactly you should be spraying something like sulfur or whatever to combat the problem. So it becomes much more complex. I mean, if you grow your own fruit, you will quickly realize that the fruit growers of the world have to perform quite a bit of magic in order to get the lovely fruit that's on the shelf. And so I have a great amount of respect for the fruit growers, and they're up against an impossible situation because everybody says they want, you know, no sprays, etc. But at the same time, they will not touch one with a black spot on it.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And so it's like you can't have your cake and eat it too, I guess.
That's right.
But I think what we need to do is just have you want a clean apple. I'm not saying you sell, you know, wormy apples or whatever, but at the same time, you have to realize that you know, a lot of fruit gets thrown away and used for juicing because, you know, it's ugly or it has a spot or it has something in it. So, you know, it's like you are actually getting the best of the best. And some growers are much better at what they do, and also they grow cultivars that give them perfect fruit. So, you know, there are a lot of the newer apples, they're there because they serve a whole range of purposes for the growers and the sellers.
Wonderful. As you mentioned your top apples to be growing, how hardy are the trees? How far north can we be planting our apple trees?
Well, our orchard, which has all of those, has taken minus 40 probably 3 times, minus 41. Used to take minus 35s consistently every winter. Now we rarely get above minus 30. You know, minus 34 was actually, this was the coldest winter we've had in maybe a decade. And it was only for a brief time. And so it was, they're pretty hardy.
Yeah.
We don't grow anything that can't survive minus 35 to minus 40.
Okay. Yeah. So you're looking in zone 3, basically. Because that's your 34 to 40.
A lot of times, a lot of these can be grown in, let's say, zone 3, especially like the warmer sections of zone 3. The problem is the time of ripening is, you know, the heat is not enough. Now there may be exceptions to that. You know, cold areas that somehow or they have a little heat sink or whatever. But even so, if you try to grow Red Delicious in a zone 3, you might get an apple, but you're not going to get anything like what you think, right? And it's the same for all of these. And we grow Yellow Delicious, your Golden Delicious here. And at the end, when we pick it finally, it's okay, but it's not, you know, the same as what a Washington State will look like, or taste like, right? They're still good, but you know, you see the differences when different geographies will produce different results, right?
Well, that's interesting. So so the hardiness means that like the tree will survive and the fruit will bear fruit, but you still need that longer, you know, the longest as possible, right? Of growing season. So, and this has been, I mean, it's like mid-September almost, and it's still been pretty warm. So I guess this is going to be hopefully a good year. It
was 28 degrees here. And
I know,
you know, in my old home, this time of year, we would be having frosts many nights, right?
Yeah.
And the falls are changing here for sure.
Yeah. Do you see any other climate change, like, you know, the fact that the climate is changing, regardless of what some people say, but I mean, how else it's affecting? Is it the longer seasons?
Well, I know what we have noticed over four decades is that in the beginning, about early 1980s, you would never be able to dig before April 15th. That was just like, and you were lucky if you got in by the 20th into the ground, right? I mean, it'd be soggy or whatever, but frozen, you couldn't, still snow. Now, we have been out in early March or late March once, but most of the time now it's by early mid-April, the ground is ready. And we don't usually freeze up now until really end of November. Used to be November 15th, the ground was solid. And now, no, we worked into December.
Wow.
So we've seen a huge expansion of that growing season. And now we are probably growing material that maybe would not have produced as good a fruit, right? Because of that extra heat that we have. And it's been hot this summer.
So there you go. Longer growing season, more fruit from varieties that normally you couldn't grow. And the soil is warmer longer and thawing quicker every season. So, I mean, the proof is definitely in the pudding for sure. I was thinking as you were talking about growing apples, you know, in New Brunswick or Ontario, and the fruit up in a colder zone, I was wondering, have you noticed any change in flavor between these different places in the fruit itself? I kind of think back to like wine and grapes, right? They kind of have that flavor profile based on somewhat of the soil they're grown in.
Yeah, I think it's almost inevitable. I mean, one of the great examples is an old English apple called Cox's Orange Pippin. And it was always considered, you know, the Olympic star of flavor, right? At least in England. And it would always grow best in the kind of drier southeast corner of England.
Okay.
And then, and sometimes when you buy them in the store, you know, somebody from Washington State, let's say, can grow Cox's Orange, but it will not taste the same as if it was grown in that section of England. Okay. And so, you know, there are, is it soils maybe, you know, geography, topography, weather, all of these factors can influence, I think. And some people say rootstocks will influence flavor as well. Make it maybe more sugars or So, I can't say, I've never studied, what the various profiles would be.
Yeah.
And you can't tell from store-bought apples because you don't know how long they've been stored. There's all these factors. You almost have to taste it right off the tree when it's right.
Now, in your book, you do have a note on taste. Can you share that with everybody?
Sure. Well, it taste, if you are a writer and you're trying to describe the taste of an apple, there are certain things you can tell them. It's acidic, it's sweet, or it's a good balance. You can say that there are aromatics there, sometimes, banana flavored or peach, and it depends on the person's nose. And a lot of people are much more sophisticated in picking up these various things. So, there are various aromatics. And it's like, how do you describe that?
Yeah.
And, there are people who have done pretty good jobs, but, you really are limited by the vocabulary. In other words, if you were into wines, oh my gosh, smells like leather, smells like old horse manure or whatever.
I know, yeah.
But in apples, it's not refined like that.
Yeah.
And so, you do the best you can, but you cannot. It's like I have one where I'm eating an ambrosia, right? And it was an interesting thing to write because I was writing as I was eating it. And it's true that you can feel and smell and taste sort of more if you're really concentrating on it, and you can really zone in on those kind of, and that's a very almost tropical fruit like apple. So it's a difficult thing to write about and to write for, but so you can give the people the bare bones, but you almost have to taste it yourself.
I was gonna say, you really comes down to tasting it yourself, and that's what I would tell people working in the garden center. What does it taste like? Does it do? And you can describe it, but you gotta bite it. You gotta just go out and try it because it's so hard to describe. Yeah. Speaking of garden centers and purchasing trees, Carla has written in, "Hi, Joanne and Matt. Okay, bottom line: if I purchased an apple tree from the nursery and planted it, how soon before I actually see fruit?"
Well, that's a little bit complex because it depends on a couple of things. Depends on the rootstock, very important, because most dwarfing rootstocks will produce fruit much earlier. So usually within 2 years, sometimes you'll even have fruit on a tiny little tree. You should actually take that off, right? To allow it to get at least to some height. So in those cases, very early. Now, it also depends on the cultivar, the type of apple. So, for instance, Northern Spy is a good example of one that on a seedling root will take 7 years or more to come into bearing. So that was always a disadvantage, and that's probably why it's not grown as much. But now with dwarfing rootstocks, you can cut that in half, right? You might be 4 years, right? But most apples generally, we like to tell people 4 years, and so you might get the odd apple and so forth. But after about 4 years, if that tree is happy, and growing well, it should be producing within 4 years. You also run into the problem with some apples of the biennial nature of most apples. In other words, they have heavy crops, light crops, heavy crops, light crops. Like a rest period almost. Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of the newer apples are pretty annual, but even so, they will thin them so that you kind of even out the production over the years, right? Thinning is important as well.
Mm-hmm. So that's another big question that we often get is how and when do I prune my apples? Is it necessary? So as you talk about thinning the trees, what is that? And then what other pruning practices should we maybe observe or be aware of?
Well, I always say to people that pruning is a dwarfing process. You're taking away the ability of the plant to make food because all of those leaves will not be produced, right? So it's not producing as much sugar. But you don't want growth to go in areas that in the long term you don't want. right? Because you don't want to expend the energy with something you're going to cut off when it's bigger. So what I would say is, as your young tree grows, make sure that if you're in a snowy area, make sure that the bottom 2 feet or so doesn't have a branch, because that will often strip, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so, gradually you can move up to a certain level and just take off 1, 2 scaffolding branches a year. Try to maintain a central leader. It's not always easy, depending on the apple. But basically, you're looking for a kind of Christmas tree form, if you will. So you have this central leader with branches going in different directions so that you balance the weight of the branches and the crop, right? And then as the tree goes older, if we're going to use the pruning methods of the high density orchards, what they do is, as soon as you have a branch that's more than half the diameter of the main trunk, you take it off. And you leave it a little bit at the base of the cut so it will form a new branch. But you always encourage the younger, flatter branches, because they're going to be the fruit producers. Now, if you prune a tree, especially prune it hard in the spring, you will get a huge reaction. It will send up water sprouts and everything, because again, it's trying to make up for that loss. It is actually, if you want to control the size, it's almost better to prune like in late June, or maybe July, early, depends on where you are, early, mid-July. And then when you prune, you don't get that strong reaction. You get more smaller laterals behind the cut. And often those will form fruit buds in spurs and so forth. And so if you want to control growth like that, it's almost better in the summer. But if you're pruning for structure, you can prune winter, spring. Everybody says don't prune, in the middle of the winter and so forth. It's not good because you can't cut into the wood properly. But if you have a warm period, I've never really seen any damage done, going back in. But generally speaking, you want to wait till the sap is beginning to flow a bit.
Okay.
For spring.
Right. So generally, we're going to prune for shape. And would you recommend taking out the larger limbs as they reach half a diameter of the trunk?
Yeah. We never did that, but that's what I would recommend nowadays. Yeah. Okay. And what you want to do is you want to keep it open enough so you get light into the centers of the tree. Right. And so you can almost think of it like layers of branches that, light can still get in, because that's where you get your color and your early ripening. Yeah, the earliest tree, or the earliest apples are always in the south side because they get more heat, right? Yes. And the ones that are in the middle will be later because they don't get as much sun, and they also they're in the shade, so that they tend to be more green rather than red. Now, if you've got yellow, it's different, but
yeah. What about in the small yards, especially I think in the GTA, and also the decorative nature of espaliering apple trees?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is it's an old method. Mm-hmm. They used to use it in England a lot because it was quite cool, and they actually wanted the heat of the wall, so they would do things like peach trees and so forth. Okay. But you can do it with apples, pears, plums, cherries, and what you're trying to do is essentially create a two-dimensional tree rather than a three-dimensional tree, and so you want to keep all the branching against the wall that you're using. What is usually done is you start with a 1-year whip of the apple cultivar of your choice on a dwarfing rootstock. And it's important that it be dwarfing because you don't want vigor, right? Mm-hmm. And so what you do is take that 1-year tree, and if it is high enough so that it's at where you first want branching, you snip it off. And what that does is we remove terminal dominance. You will get several breaks below it. And those you start to train out. Or if a fan shape, it doesn't matter, whatever shape you want. But usually fan shapes or horizontals work best.
Okay.
And as the tree grows, you continue this process so that you create what looks like a ladder or like a fan. And then as it ages, what you're going to find is that you will get vigorous growth. You remove the vigorous growth, especially if it's growing away from the wall, and you leave the non-vigorous shoots. And after a while too, you have to actually thin the spurs, because you will get too many apples, or you can thin by hand.
Okay.
And what you want to do is you want to space out the apples. You'll get better size on them, and usually better quality as well. But it's a fascinating way to grow. And we've had some here. We actually just lost a couple from the borer. So this time the one that is left was infested. And this time I came up with a new solution, which is I take a silicone caulk gun with a tip, very small tip, shove it in the hole they make, and squeeze it until it comes out. And this completely gets rid of them. And it doesn't seem to harm the tree a bit.
Okay.
But they're tree killers.
So we are in our last 5 minutes of the show. Great information. Thank you again so much for joining us and sharing your knowledge and your wonderful book. Again, Hardy Apples, Growing Apples in Cold Climates. For those who maybe have joined late, check it out in all the major bookstores, Chapter, Barnes and Nobles, as well as on Amazon.com and .ca. Every guest we have, we always like to give you guys a little time to talk about anything that maybe we didn't talk about, or promote something, or something that maybe is dear to your heart, or you want to share with us. So is there anything that you want to jump in there with before we end?
Well, I mean, one of the things that's kind of interesting, you write a book on whether it's roses or apples or whatever, and so everybody kind of thinks that this is your favorite thing or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
And the thing is that I love it all. I love our evergreens. I love our ash trees, and and everything. I think it's just an amazing, almost an honor to be able to grow stuff for a living. Really, I'm the luckiest person probably that has ever lived, because I live surrounded by trees, shrubs, perennials, fruit trees. You go out and have some plums and one next day, and then you're climbing up and picking the Novamax and handing them out. And it's growing your own stuff. But it's true that apples have a special kind of thing for me because they're food. And when I started gardening, it was about food, and I actually made fun of people that had flowers, right? But it was the grandmothers and grandpas. Well, I'm a grandfather of 12, so I appreciate all of it now.
Oh wow, that's great. And are the kids involved?
Yeah, my daughter and son-in-law are heavily involved, as are my grandchildren to a certain extent.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love to see that. I love to see, because there's so much for the period of time pre-COVID, there was a lot of, where the farms were, or the nurseries were not, being passed from generation to generation. And I think that's turned in a little bit, because I think that the next generation is having a bit more interest in the land and seeing the importance of it. So, so I think that's great. Our apple trees, so mail order, so we can order on your website. Is there other things that we can order mail order that you ship to Ontario, or is it mostly?
We ship basically roses, small fruits, and shrubs, sometimes perennials, depending. But it's generally bare root material that's shipped out early in the spring, usually late April. And so it comes to you dormant, and that we seem to have good luck.
Oh, excellent.
That's amazing. Do you have any of the newer columnar apples, or have you ever seen those?
Yeah, I have a few of the ornamental ones. I haven't really gotten into the edible ones yet. Emerald Spire, I think it is, and but anyway, they're fascinating trees, really. Because I am a fan of like fastigiate trees and very narrow trees.
Mhm.
I have a temple sugar maple, which is really narrow, and
Yes,
I just
yeah.
love stuff like that. I'm a collector, really. This is an excuse for
Oh,
collecting.
oh, that's good. Yeah, as a designer in the city, or I guess I'm more in the suburbs, but tall narrow trees are like the hot item because everybody's worried about everybody's window. Like, it's so funny. Like, it's like during COVID, everybody realized they had neighbors all of a sudden. I don't know. So now everybody has to block every view. And we're also, and they're not realizing that everybody's so busy with their own stuff. They don't have time to watch what other people are doing, but it's selling a lot of columnar trees.
Yeah, that's the number one, I would say 9 times out of 10, when somebody comes to us, they want us to put in a landscape, it's to hide the neighbors.
Yeah.
Yep.
Or at least to feel privacy. And I understand that. I mean, I live where I can do anything I want because my neighbor is ages away from me. But at the same time, it's like it doesn't feel very communal.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So it's a kind of a mixed bag.
Yes, for sure.
Well, that brings us to the end of this week's episode of Down the Garden Path here on Reality Radio 101. Bob, thank you very much again for taking the time out of your busy schedule and your wonderful garden, I'm sure, without being able to see it, for joining us here to talk about your wonderful book, Hardy Apples, Growing Apples in Cold Climates, available at all major bookstores and online on Amazon. Don't forget to take a look for Bob Osborne's book all about roses. And don't forget to check out cornhillnursery.com for more of the inside scoop on Bob, his wonderful nursery venture, and all about growing apples. So thank you very much again, Bob, for joining us.
My pleasure.
And we will see everybody again next week, next Monday here on Reality Radio 101 with a brand new topic. And you are again listening to Down the Garden Path. We'll talk to you all next week. Thanks again. And we'll see you soon. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Down the Garden Path with your host, Joanne Shaw and Matthew Dressing, right here on Reality Radio 101.